Chapter 6 My Lonely Valentine. Going back a little, there was a little incident that happened right before we moved off campus. It was this moment in time that changed everything. As I have already mentioned, Tosh was introduced to the group because she and Richard were dating. At the time we were talking about moving off campus, the two of them had been dating for quite a while. However, it was not exactly smooth sailing for them. The main reason was Richard, who was not exactly ready to settle down. While Tosh was someone who wanted to be committed, she did not understand that it was not in Richard's nature to commit to one girl only. Well, it was his nature only at that time. Who knew how he would be in 5 or 10 years? Anyways, he was not going to commit to Tosh. He was way too good with the ladies to settle for one, as he would often say. So, with these two personalities coming together in a relationship, the end result was that Tosh chased him around the campus while he cheated on her behind her back. It was Valentine's Day, and Richard was with another girl. He was, as usual, trying to make sure that Tosh did not find out. So, to help him keep things under wraps, he asked Pete for assistance. Pete was his oldest friend and would do anything for him. Like I mentioned, Pete was loyal to a fault. That was his one and only trait that could be counted as his weakness, and Richard made sure that he exploited this weakness when it came to asking him to cover his actions with Tosh. Richard had made up quite a good lie that Pete could feed to Tosh when she came around looking for him in his dorm room. The plan was for Pete to tell her that Richard was spending the day with his sister Julia, as her mother was not feeling well. "Why the hell would Richard put me in this situation?" Pete exclaimed in front of us right after Richard had left with his new girlfriend. "I think the reason is that you let him, Pete," Sosh replied in a calm voice. "He knows he has gotten you wrapped around his little finger, and you let him get away with it. What the hell am I supposed to say to Tosh? She is going to be here any minute." "Yep, you're right on that account," Sosh replied. "Which is why the rest of us are leaving and going to the museum tonight. You can spend the evening putting Richard's matters in order." Sosh was trying to drive Pete so that he would understand he could not always let Richard put him in these kinds of situations. Pete hung his head, brooding. He was not looking forward to meeting Tosh tonight. That much was evident from his face. "Maybe I will just say that Richard was not here. It's not a lie, right?" Pete looked up at us with a defeated, hopeful expression. It was an expression of a man who knew he was grasping at straws. Sosh shrugged his shoulders and made sure to hold Pete's eyes for a long while. He was once again making sure that Pete understood that fooling himself into thinking that he was doing the right thing was not going to get him out of this situation. The only way out was to make sure that he never let Richard put him in this kind of situation ever again. When we filed, we saw Tosh coming from one end of the corridor. She wasn't looking happy. So, of course, the rest of us hurriedly waved in her direction and ran the opposite way. We did not want to be confronted with questions about Richard. It was a matter that Pete had landed us in, and he was the one who was responsible for taking us out of that. When faced with threats from the outside, we were going to be united. But when it came to condoning irresponsible behavior of a team member, we were not going to be a part of it. Pete needed to know that Richard had vices, and Richard needed to know that he could not take everyone he wanted for a ride. There was a limit. Anyways, when Tosh entered the room, Pete was still standing and looking blankly at the wall. He knew he had to get on with his own project that was at a very crucial juncture. Yet he found that his mind had refused to focus. Tosh was standing at the door looking at him for a good 2 minutes before he realized that she was there. He was startled to find her there looking at him. The way she was looking at him indicated to him that she had obviously asked him a question, which he had of course missed. He asked her to repeat herself, and she asked if he knew where Richard was. He looked at her and said with what he hoped was nonchalance that he had gone out. When he looked away and started to walk toward his computer with a distracted air, Tosh asked him what was going on. Pete started to tell her about his project, and she decided to stay back and help him. "It is not like I have any place better to be," Tosh said to Pete in what he thought was a wistful voice. When Pete detected wistfulness in her voice, he wanted to make Tosh feel better. Tosh was looking so forlorn that Pete blurted out, "You look stunning in that dress." After this, Pete immediately went tomato red. So that made Tosh laugh, and she started to chat with him normally. When Pete looked at her laughing, his embarrassment vanished, and he also started talking to her. After a particularly animated discussion, when there was a lull in the conversation, Tosh looked at him and asked if he wanted to hear his secret. Tosh looked at him squarely in the eye and said, "I know Richard is out with another girl tonight. I have known that he was cheating on me for a while." Pete was so shocked he was not even able to formulate an expected exclamation of, "What?" Pete just stared at her in silent wonderment. "You probably want to know why I have still been going out with him all this time," Tosh said in response to his look of confusion. Pete silently nodded his head. Tosh was suddenly looking very vulnerable and abashed. She was now the one who was bright red. That only made Pete even more confused. "I am here for you, idiot," Tosh exclaimed at him, when he still would not get the hint. It was then the two of us who had been standing outside the room started cheering and came inside. Even though we did not know that Tosh was going to confess her love that night, both of them jumped up at the noise we were making. We both high-fived each other and left the two alone to sort out the rest of it. It was Tosh who had told me a long time ago that Tosh was not in love with Richard. At first, he had not been sure, but it had been quite a while now that he was sure that Tosh was, in fact, in love with Pete. It was after this that their relationship began to bloom. Both of them kept it under wraps, and Tosh started to withdraw from Richard, but did not tell him that she and Pete were dating. She would pop into his room to be with Pete when Richard was not there. This went on for a while, but it was eating away at Pete. Like I have said, he was loyal to a fault. And even though he did not like the way Richard treated Tosh, and even though he was completely in love with Tosh himself now, he was not the kind of guy who would go behind another guy's back to be with his girlfriend. These thoughts were making him crazy, and his mood swings were getting worse by the day. He came to the conclusion that he would first talk to Tosh and ask her to choose either him or Richard. The reason was that their situation was getting worse day by day. Tosh had to be with Richard when the whole group met, and she had to stay up late to sneak out of Richard's room to meet Pete. They would meet in the washroom or the walk-in pantry. It was getting stifling for both of them. It was hard for Pete to look Richard in the face when we were discussing some work-related issue. It was harder for him to look at Tosh sitting so close to Richard during these discussions. He wanted to ask Tosh to choose between the two of them. Even though Pete was going to ask Tosh to choose, he was certain in his mind that it was him. She had to choose him because Richard was always cheating on her, and it was her, after all, who had been the one to go after him. However, on the other side of these thoughts were the thoughts that he was seeing his best friend's girlfriend behind his back. Richard was a cheater, so why should he be with the love of my life? Why should he be with Tosh? She's so kind, giving, and super smart. I can't stand sharing her. I have to talk to Tosh. She has to choose, Richard or me. Then again, Richard was his best friend. Why is this so difficult? These were the things that kept Pete awake at night, when he was not kept awake by Tosh sneaking out to meet him. Although this was reason enough for him to be disturbed, there were other reasons for him to be disturbed as well. The Chinese, who had been doing so much for us the last couple of months, were now back to cash in their chips. They had been secretly working on the salami scam project for the last 2 years. It was also known as the skim scam. The idea here was based on moving funds from multiple U.S. accounts in small portions, so that it would be hard to trace. The Chinese had accumulated around $2.5 million, and the only thing they wanted from us was ATM runners. Now, that meant they needed people to take cash from the accounts in a certain amount of time that had been laid out in perfect succession over a large area of the city. Even though it sounded like a simple thing on our part, it was the most difficult thing. From where were we going to arrange that many people who could be relied upon? All of them would want to be paid a hefty amount. In fact, there was nothing stopping them from walking away with the cash that they withdrew from the ATMs. Pete was furious with the Chinese. They know we specialized in hacking. The only thing we lack is manpower. That is why I have had to turn to them in the first place to ask for an extra pair of hands and brains. The one task that was going to prove the most difficult for us was the one they handed us. This is just great. This was one of the many rants that Pete went on when he first heard what the Chinese wanted us to do. However, no matter how much he ranted, he knew that he was indebted to them and had to pay up. Otherwise, they would come after him and everyone who knew him. Those were the rules of the game we were playing. If you did not deliver, your life was forfeited. Anyways, the Chinese planned on keeping 3/5 of the money, which would be converted in Bitcoin, and the balance was for us. After our initial chat with the Chinese, we all sat down and tried to go over the specs of the operation. Pete and Logic concluded that we would need around 30 runners for the ATMs if we were to pull all of the funds out in a synchronized move that was at least likely to be noticed by the banks. This was a headache because, as I said, we did not have enough trustworthy people to make the withdrawals, and anyways, most people's limit was $500. So we were stuck there as well. How to work around that? Richard was diligently thinking of creative ideas, and after several failed ones, he came up with, what if we just create fake IDs, suit up, walk into the bank, and withdraw larger amounts? This would mean that we would reach our mark much faster. Well, Pete vetoed the idea because it was really risky. It would mean that we would have to show our faces at the bank, which would get recorded. That was a complete no-no. So we all moved on to the next idea. I caught Pete looking at Tosh from the corner of his eyes. She was sitting next to Richard, and it was hard for Pete to concentrate on anything while both of them sat that close to each other. Tosh had conceived Sibby on that fateful night, although none of us found out about this until much later. For now, Pete and Tosh did not realize or care about the fallout that would surely happen between Pete and Richard. Well, it did happen, but in a way none of us expected. Please pick up the second book, Rise of the CEOs and We Are Back, from the Dark Cumulus series at your nearest bookstore or on Amazon.com.